in a minute. Okay, we're going to begin momentarily, and I just want everyone viewing to understand that this event is being recorded and we will live stream it. So we're ready to go. So welcome everybody to today's teach-in, organized as part of today's National Day of Action for Higher Education. I'm Irene Mulvey. I'm president of the American Association of University Professors and the moderator for today's teach-in. Just as background, this is an event organized by a grassroots movement that started with a few AAUP chapters and has grown to include many more AAUP chapters, AFT locals, other higher ed unions, student organizations, and many other organizational allies. It has been an absolute joy to be part of and to watch this grassroots movement organize and mobilize so many of us in higher education for today and beyond. We did not plan for the National Day of Action to coincide with today's hearing in the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. That is entirely coincidental. And as the day grew closer, the organizers were adamant that we did not want our mobilization efforts to be seen only as our efforts relate to that hearing. Of course, now that we've seen the hearing, now that we've seen, let's call it what it is, now that we've seen the political theater, the cynicism, the exact opposite of what we try to do on our campus when we try to understand complicated and polarizing topics, it's hard to ignore the hearing. Let me just say that today's hearing illustrates as clear as day for anyone who cares about higher education, a free society, and democracy, the need for this movement. In addition to all the other problems we're facing and talking about today, dark money, precarity, contingency, underfunding, the hearing shows us that we're also facing McCarthyism 2.0, even down to the naming of names. We have a very full live stream planned, so that's all I'm going to say. The hearing is a clear illustration of the need for our movement. If you haven't seen the National Day of Action website, I encourage you to check it out when you can. We will drop the link in the chat. In particular, if you scroll down, you will find the movement's principles in the future we stand for. I would distill it into bullet points for you, but that wouldn't do it justice. You really need to read the whole thing and then read it again and then share it with as many people as you can think of. In short, okay, here are some bullet points. We stand for democracy and the system of higher education that sustains it. We stand for the freedom to teach, to learn, to assemble, to protest. We stand for job security, fair pay, and better working conditions. We stand for higher education as a public good for all. We stand together, starting with today's National Day of Action for Higher Education. Our National Day of Action is and continues to be an unqualified success. We have 4 fantastic panelists covering a range of academic worker categories that will speak to a range of important issues that we all need to understand as we stand together on the threshold of a counter-revolution and fight back together. Before I get to the speakers, I've been asked to highlight some events that have taken place today. I don't know where to begin. Actions took place literally coast to coast and north to south. Rutgers celebrated their 1-year anniversary of their historic strike with a strike-iversary. Indiana grad students have gone on strike for 3 days. Wesleyan AAUP, Boston University, Penn AAUP, United Faculty of Florida had a teach-in on DEI, UT Austin, Vanderbilt, Ball State University, University of Maryland AAUP, UConn had a rally on stopping the cuts. the Tennessee Coalition for Truth in Education and Tennessee Tech AAP, Wayne State University, University of Nebraska, Lincoln AAP. This is all I've heard about without even looking hard for information. And if I didn't mention your group, I'm sorry. We had over 100 campuses participating in actions designed around the issues they are facing on campus. It's 5 p.m. here on the East Coast, so people may be watching this live stream teaching after an action. And elsewhere, others may be gearing up for a rally. But to everyone watching, let's just have high fives all around. This has been an incredible success. Thanks to all of you. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to remind you of the resources on the National Day of Action website. There are fantastic resources on 6 important topics. On behalf of the organizers, thank you to our colleagues who created these resources. We've been calling them one-pagers, but that doesn't do them justice. They are brief but comprehensive summaries of important issues facing higher education today, along with further resources and readings. They're an excellent resource to begin learning and helping to educate others as we grow our movement. We have 4 panelists. Each will talk for a few minutes on their topic, and then I will moderate our discussion. Our first speaker is Rana Jalil. Rana is an associate professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies and Asian American studies at the University of California, Davis. She is a longtime AAUP activist member. She is currently chair of AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure. Her first book, The Work of Rape, received a 2021 Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Award and was co-winner of the 2022 Gloria E. Anzaldúa Prize from the National Women's Studies Association. So I will turn the Zoom over to Rana.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you everyone who was involved in organizing today, because it really has been inspiring to watch. So I was asked today to talk about academic freedom and DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, which have been under intensifying attack by the right wing since early 2023. But today is also Palestinian Prisoners' Day. Columbia University, as we just heard, has been subjected to a congressional anti-Semitism probe where the president of the university pulled a McCarthy and named the names of 3 of her faculty, 1 contingent, to be investigated to Congress. And in addition to that, all 11 universities in Gaza have been either destroyed or partially destroyed. So today, I'm going to put DEI in these conversations together in order to do 2 things. First, underscore the role of the state in perpetuating racial inequities and violence, a problem that DEI efforts to include more people alone on our campuses won't solve. And 2, to encourage everyone to continue to organize and push back at every attempt by political actors in the state to exert more control over speech and expression on campus, whether we agree with the speech or expression or not, and especially and unfortunately when the language of anti-discrimination is selectively and opportunistically invoked, which I'll explain shortly. But first, I just want to cover a little bit about what's happening with DEI on campus. So proponents of DEI view it as an effective strategy to repair decades of exclusionary policies and practices that have kept people in color in particular off their campuses. Meanwhile, Republican leaders say the practice violate free speech, they break anti-discrimination laws, and are misuse of public money. This controversy has resulted in dozens of campuses altering or eliminating jobs, dismantling entire offices, and overhiring hiring practices and programs amid mounting political pressure to end recruitment and retention of underrepresented faculty, staff, and students. So attacks on DEI, therefore, are, among other things, labor issues and part of a larger political strategy to undermine public confidence in higher education in order to justify governmental oversight. And this brings me to my second point, which is this. Alongside these efforts to dismantle DEI are corresponding but not identical attempts to dictate what can be taught, researched, and thought on higher education. And these are campaigns to eviscerate the possibilities of certain kinds of political speech that is critical of state histories and practices, and the congressional investigations are a part of this. So from attacks on critical race theory and the US and US history to teaching about Palestine, as the AUP's Committee A wrote in our March 22 report, Legislative Threats to Academic Freedom, Redefinitions of Anti-Semitism and Racism. This is the quotation. The past few years have seen an increase in partisan political attempts to restrict the public education curriculum and to portray some forms of public education as a social harm. Two targets are particularly evident: teaching about the history, policies, and actions of the State of Israel, and teaching about the history and perpetuation of racism and other accounts of state-enabled violence in the United States, end quote. And again, this was from March 2022. If we ignore what's happening here, with administrations bowing to opportunistic congressional investigations, with U.S. legislative redefinitions of anti-Semitism and racism, one expanding while the other constricts, then we're foreclosing histories of race and organizing that were not simply about inclusion into murderous states, but about social transformation. So representation is important, and at the same time, DEI is not the only or last word on racial justice on campus. If we ignore what's happening when the president of Columbia University hands over her faculty to the federal government for their speech, for their critiques of state power, we risk ignoring as well the deliberate destruction of knowledge in Palestine, what the Palestinian Feminist Collective has named sophicide, and also scholasticide for the targeting of academic knowledge and scholars and related personnel around the universities. As Congress investigates anti-Semitism on our campuses, while Palestinians are bombed by the Israeli state, we're witnessing not only a capitulation to state power and outside interference in higher education, but also the active destruction of the practice and principles of higher education, the decimation of free inquiry necessary to democracy, the ability to tell different histories and different stories, the ability to speak against the state. So in conclusion, I just want to encourage you to join or found an AUP chapter, support student and worker organizing. And here's a shout out to Students for Justice in Palestine, the students who are agitating at Columbia right now risking arrest, and the Indiana graduate student workers who are currently all on strike. The National AP is commenting now on the Columbia investigation, and we will continue to push against all incursions into academic freedom on our campuses. So let's keep organizing together, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you very, very much for your remarks and your fantastic work on our Committee A. Our next speaker is Jason Wozniak. Jason is a higher ed researcher and organizer with the Debt Collective, and he teaches at Westchester University.
All right. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, everyone else, the organizers, and solidarity with the people in the streets across the world in our country, resisting a lot of things that Rana just mentioned. And I'm going to talk a little bit about higher education debt. It almost seems absurd to talk about student debt in light of some of the things that are happening right now: scholasticide, genocide, non-ending persecution of people that are fighting for justice and against settler colonialism, amongst other things. But I do want to make a case to say that actually by eliminating debt, we strengthen our movements for justice. We strengthen our movements both in higher education and in society writ large. And that's because I think one of the big takeaways from what I want to get across today is that debt is and has been in the past a disciplinary mechanism by which you can control and discipline those people that would fight for justice. And so really briefly, some remarks on this. I want to highlight there's two different types of higher education debt. The first one's well known, student loan debt. By now, we've heard a lot about this. Roughly $1.6 trillion worth of debt held by students and graduates. This is a debt that is gendered and racialized. 66% of the student debt is held by women, and the highest levels of student debt is held by BIPOC populations. There's another type of debt, though, in higher education that we need to acknowledge, and we can call this university or institutional debt. This is when your universities are in debt. And what ends up happening here is we have $175 billion in total. So universities owe to Wall Street and other lenders around $175 billion total. That's an increase of over 482% from 1989 to 2021. What that means, amongst other things, is that financiers, Wall Street, and creditors get an extraordinary amount of power over what happens on our campuses. This drives a lot of austerity policies. This leads to cuts to programs. This leads to cuts to departments. This leads to further adjunctification. And in fact, credit rating agencies will give a university higher credit ratings if that university has weaker labor protections and or unions. So you see that what we call a shadow governance that's put in place. And this is one of the things that drives some of the draconian cuts that we're seeing across the nation right now. Both these types of debt are the result of neoliberal policy and politics, or what Wolfgang Streeck has called a shift from a tax state to a debt state. Really briefly, one of the things that happens in the last 40, 50 years is that a tax state would be you would have public goods and programs funded for via taxes on the wealthy and corporations, hopefully. A debt state, though, is when public goods are financed through debt. And what happens is, we all know, is that there's been drastic cuts to taxes for both corporations and wealthy individuals. And then what ends up happening is that for public institutions to run, and this includes K through 12 schools, they have to seek out loans from Wall Street in order to do operations and capital projects. And so this drives these systems into debt. It's also one of the reasons why individuals go into debt, because there's less money available for public goods that could keep them stay out of it. So again, what this ends up meaning, or the implications of this, is what I already said, that education debt is a disciplinary and control mechanism. It's a gift to capital in the form of it creates obedient and a precarious workforce that is more exploitable. It sets up, and this is important, asymmetrical creditor-debtor relations in which the creditor holds leverage over debtors. And so one of the reasons why some of the people that threaten us can threaten us is because they can threaten us with debt. Debt was a response to student protests in the 1960s. It was an attempt to make sure, along with defunding higher education, especially the publics, it was an attempt to make sure that we would never see the type of agitation and movements that we saw in the 1960s. And the idea would be that if you're massively in debt, you both have to work all the time, and so you can't participate in some of the movements that you'd like to. And if you get into trouble, how are you going to pay those debts back? And so what ends up happening then is that you get less participation. So I would just want to say to end this, that I think we need to ask ourselves, what do we owe all the people, including the people on this call, that are stepping out, putting bodies on the line, putting their careers on the line, putting their degrees on the line? We know people are being suspended without due process. What do we say to the contingent faculty, to the faculty that are throwing it all out into the streets right now, giving it everything they can, even though they're massively indebted? And if they lose their jobs, that's a huge consequence. And then I want to say, imagine what would happen. Imagine how many more people would join the fight if they weren't massively indebted, if they had more time because they weren't working 2 to 3 jobs to service debt, if they had greater freedoms and they weren't worried about what happens if I get doxxed and I lose my degree and or I can't get a job and I'm massively in debt. Imagine how many more people we could have in the struggle. And so that is one of the big reasons, not just because obviously it helps our economic, our pocketbooks, but also because we need to cancel debt because it helps us build power. And so this action today, the efforts of Debt Collective and other groups need to push on. We need not only full universal debt cancellation, but we also need funding for higher education across the country. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Jason. Our next speaker is Erica Merrill Thomas. Erica is an organizer of adjunct faculty at Portland State University. At PSU, she's the chair of the Political Action for the Adjunct Faculty Union, PSUFA. She is an at-large steering committee member in the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. She teaches interdisciplinary general education classes, and she's an artist. You can look in I'm having Mariah drop in the chat various websites. So we're putting one for Erica's. She's an artist making work about labor and capitalism. So welcome, Erica.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thanks for people showing up in person to give me an audience to speak to. So I want to start by explaining what an adjunct is, just in case there are people who don't know what that means on this call. We are part-time faculty who are hired for limited contract appointments. at a lower rate per credit hour than full-time faculty are paid. In most cases, we're not eligible for university benefits like healthcare or retirement. And many of us are not eligible for public student loan forgiveness due to being part-time employees. I chose to study art and to spend my life on that practice and engaged in teaching and political organizing, which is, I believe, the best way I could spend my limited time here on Earth. There's very little funding for that in the United States, as we all know. So cultural producers are poorly paid for our work. I have about $68,000 worth of student loan debt for my terminal degree, my MFA, and I'm paid about $25,000 a year by PSU for teaching 20 credit hours. Here at PSU, 47% of our faculty are adjuncts, and we teach 38%. These numbers are sort of squishy, they change year to year, but about 38% of classes are taught by adjuncts, with an emphasis on undergraduate and higher enrollment courses. For my students, the majority of whom come from working class backgrounds, they were promised access to public education, a public university, and they often have to make a decision about what they're going to study in school based on, as they often refer to it, the ROI of their education. And rather than study something that they're actually interested in, they are weighing how much debt they're going into compared to what they might make at a job, which is also changing all the time. And so it's not a very good equation either. I became a labor organizer the first moment that I was hired as an adjunct. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that I accepted this position, knowing that the working conditions are notoriously bad and the pay notoriously bad. And that's because I believe that our ability to withhold our labor is actually one of the only meaningful leverage points that we have inside of capitalism to put pressure on and change, to put pressure on the ruling class and to change the way that things are. Unions also give us the power to protect our jobs when we exercise academic and political speech. As I mentioned, PSU, very working class university, it's public, and in this contemporary neoliberalized campus environment, our funding no longer comes from public money for the most part. We at PSU receive about 13% of our university funding publicly, and the remainder of that comes from foundations, investments, real estate holdings, and other private sources. So the skyrocketing cost of undergraduate education, as Jason mentioned, is also a reaction, a disciplinary reaction to student organizing in the 60s and 70s. And this has resulted in the depoliticization of campus life and student bodies, because keeping us in debt and chained to jobs that don't pay us well enough makes it very hard to find time for organizing. I also don't think that my students nor any of you listening here should have to choose your path in life, your profession, based on whether you can afford to do something meaningful or not with your life. This model of artists that was from the 20th century, where you could live cheaply, you could have a sort of non-professionalized job and then do your work, potentially living off of grants or public funding. This existed about a century ago, is no longer possible. And also the cost of housing in every city is exponentially outpacing wages, making that money worth less and less. I just don't think we want to live in a world in which the only people who can afford to be artists, writers, filmmakers, musicians are the wealthy. And I think we deserve culture and thought produced by people with perspectives from the working class. And it's not just artists, but journalists, social workers, historians, teachers, home care workers, service industry workers, historians, which I said twice, people in social sciences are all told that they should have chosen something that pays better if they wanted to make more money. Jobs that serve the public good, reproductive labor, any work that is not directly in service to capital is told to us that will be underpaid. So as faculty contingency increases, both for part-time and full-time non-tenure track faculty, this makes us more precarious to budgetary excuses to eliminate our positions with no recourse by canceling classes that we teach and closing programs. So you can imagine that this makes it very difficult to organize or teach about political issues ending the genocide in Palestine, protesting financial decisions of our boards of trustees, divesting our investments from fossil fuel companies, Boeing, anti-austerity protests, labor activism make us vulnerable to quiet elimination from our jobs. If you're a troublemaker, it's easy for the administration to simply not renew your course, and then you disappear from the institution and you are no longer in your union. Full-time faculty often also do not want to get dragged down by these struggles. With apologies to the very amazing full-time faculty sitting here in this room, we sometimes we see them taking less risks than us. We also see adjuncts whose spouses support them or who see themselves as sort of temporarily embarrassed tenure-track professors who will distance themselves from their own colleagues, their own adjunct colleagues' struggles because they personally have financial security and they don't need to worry about it. So while wall-to-wall unions can be very powerful, they also come with this trick where you are inside of a union or an organizing context in which there is an inherent sort of power dynamic and hierarchy between the adjuncts and the full-time faculty. Sometimes we are scapegoated or intentionally left out of university governance, curriculum decisions, and can be the recipients of anti-solidaristic activity by full-time colleagues, but especially by administration in all those cases. And so the way forward is through solidarity. We have to unionize workplaces, unionize universities, build solidarity across job sectors, and recognize that all work deserves a living wage, including graduate student work, the barista who made my coffee in this university building, the childcare workers who are taking care of our faculty's children and our students' children while we teach and learn. All deserve living wages. We need to cancel all debt. We need to fight austerity. We need to resist McCarthyism. And that I'll conclude my portion. Thank you for your time.
You shouldn't have muted till the applause was over. That was good. That was excellent. Thank you very much, Erica, and your audience. Our next speaker is Isaac Kamola. Isaac is an associate professor of political science at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He is the author of Free Speech and Coke Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War with Ralph Wilson, 2021, and Making the World Global, U.S. Universities and the Production of the Global Imaginary, 2019. He currently serves as the director of the brand new AAUP Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom. He did not say in his bio that he is one of the founders of Faculty First Responders, but you may know him from that. And so I'm putting that in the chat. So off to you, Isaac.
Thank you so much for everybody who's put this on, the organizers of the Day of Action, everybody who's been out in the street and protesting. Congratulations to the graduate students out on strike today in Indiana, and to everybody who's doing good work, fighting for a better future for higher education. I want to talk today about the political infrastructure behind the right-wing attacks on academic freedom, attacks on DEI programs, attacks on shared governance, are also the same people who are pushing austerity and pushing the neo-McCarthyism. The hearings today in Congress have been described as a form of political theater. I think with very few exceptions, and maybe some of the best theater, this theater is not spontaneous, right? Theater is organized, is orchestrated, there's an infrastructure behind it. And so when the president of Colombia gets dragged behind to Congress, this doesn't happen spontaneously. When Texas closes its DEI programs, that doesn't happen spontaneously. When dozens or in a dozen states pass academic gag orders, that doesn't happen spontaneously. There's a political infrastructure behind it. And I think that as we resist and push back against these attacks on higher education, that it's necessary for us to also understand the political infrastructure that we're up against. For those of us who are following Columbia President Shafiq's testimony before Congress, You'll note that she has publicly thrown faculty under the bus, and she has announced the firing of professors and the relief of duties of others. I just want to take a note. I want to take time to note that this is exactly the opposite response of the strategy that was proposed by nearly 24 Jewish faculty at Columbia and Barnard in their open letter published 2 days ago in Academe blog. This was a powerful letter, and if you'll excuse me, I just want to read it because I think it really nicely summarizes what we're up against. These professors wrote, "The real purpose of these hearings has been to rehearse and amplify decades-long bad faith efforts to undermine universities as sites of learning, critical thinking, and knowledge production. These hearings proceed from the spurious premise that academic studies of race, as well as gender and sexuality, have noxiously polluted campuses. From there, they assert that this pestilent culture has caused anti-Semitism to thrive. Thus, they attempt to establish two falsehoods as fact. That critical study of complex historical truths leads to anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism is rampant on campus. This reasoning is a closed loop. It can't be refuted from inside its mendacious logic." As I said, I couldn't have said it better. But what I want to do with my talk is to focus on how this closed loop of bad faith attacks on academic freedom has been manufactured within a well-funded political machinery, which includes billionaire-funded think tanks. I don't have a lot of time, so let me just point to just a few examples. This is just skimming the tip of the surface of kind of the political infrastructure that's in place. Exhibit A, Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute regularly brags about how he has manufactured, he has used his platform at the Manhattan Institute to as a megaphone to rebrand all discussions of race and racism in America as critical race theory, which he defines as the perfect villain. Nobody likes to talk about race. Nobody likes criticism or theory. And therefore, it's that thing that you can turn and describe all concepts of race as critical race theory as a way to delegitimize those conversations. What is the Manhattan Institute from which that platforms Rufo publishes his writings? They are funded by the same plutocrats Jane Mayer writes about in Dark Money: Donors Trust, Bradley Foundation, Searle Trust, Scafee Foundation, Leonard Leo's 85 Fund, Charles Koch, and others. Exhibit B. The Manhattan Institute, Heritage Foundation, Claremont Institute, and other think tanks have produced a deluge of reports, op-eds, and other publications attacking CRT and campus DI efforts, and have recently explicitly and strategically also tied in anti-Semitism, drawing connections with Black Lives Matter and support for Hamas in a whole series of op-eds and media appearances that try to create this false narrative about what's taking place in higher education that's not rooted in the actual conversations that are taking place on campus or actual scholarship. What is Heritage Foundation? In 2022, Heritage Foundation has received $106 million from many of the same donors as the Manhattan Institute. And the Claremont Institute was funded by Republican mega donor Thomas Klingenstein, who expressed in public correspondence revealed by the New York Times that his desire is not only to, quote, rid schools of critical race theory, but rather to ensure that schools teach, quote, our politics. All education is political. He basically says he wants to replace his preferred curriculum into schools. Exhibit 3, the Center for Renewing America, the Manhattan Institute, Heritage Foundation, and other think tanks have written model bills that have been the basis for academic gag orders and legislation banning campus DEI efforts. 99 academic gag orders have been introduced affecting higher education. Roughly 80% of these use nearly identical language drawn from the model legislation developed by these right-wing think tanks. And a number of those gag orders have passed in Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and elsewhere. Exhibit 4. Texas's ban on DEI offices, Senate Bill 17, was drawn directly from the Manhattan Institute's model legislation and adapted by the fossil fuel funded state think tank, Texas Public Policy Foundation. In the public hearings around this bill, 150 citizens, more than 150 citizens, came out to testify against the bill, including many educators, whereas less than a half dozen, less than 6 people came out to testify in support of those bills, and most of those who came out to support were from the Heritage Foundation and from Texas Public Policy Institute. Exhibit, what am I? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhibit A, we just need to look at Christopher Rufo's Twitter. On October, 5 days after October 7th, Rufo tweeted, "Conservatives need to create a strong association between Hamas, BLM, DSA, and academic decolonization in the public mind. Connect the dots, then attack, delegitimize, and discredit. Make the left of center disavow them and make them politically untouchables." That's exactly the strategy that's been used to conflate talks about race and racism, to conflate critiques of the state of Israel and Black Lives Matter, to conflate it all with support for Hamas. He also then tweeted, after Claudine Gay was fired, he tweeted, "Scalped." We don't need to think too much about what that means, the historical implications of that, and what the insinuation of what he was doing when he was bragging about, quote unquote, scalping a Black woman president. And then at Politico, he later admitted, quote, "I've run the same playbook on critical race theory, on gender ideology, on DEI bureaucracy for the time being. And given the structure of our institutions," notice that, given the structure of our institutions, like those of the conservative right, "this is a universal strategy that can be applied by the right to most issues. I think that we've demonstrated that it can be successful." So how do we resist? First, I would say follow the money. These attacks work less if we are constantly pointing out who is funding them, who is behind them, the organizations and the entities, that these are not spontaneous. And in fact, they need a massive political infrastructure precisely because these claims are on the wrong side of history. We need to and be inspired by the AAU activists at George Mason and others who've done incredible work demonstrating the dark money on their campus and the way that that has affected what's going on in the classroom and what's going on at their board of visitors. Secondly, we need to fight for collective bargaining contracts and faculty manual language that protects academic freedom protections. Third, we need to organize across and outside the university, students, staff, K-12 educators, librarians, parents, they're all our allies. And for this, I look at Rutgers, AAUP, AFT, and other unions that have adopted the strategy of bargaining for the common good. We need to demonstrate in the streets, in our chapters and in our unions, that higher education is a public good, and to understand what that means in as expansive a way as possible. And finally, for all the media out there, don't fall for the astroturfed outrage machine, especially since this outrage machine now has a long track record, explicit track record, a record of actively seeking to destroy the careers of faculty, and especially faculty of color. Please, please, please refuse to carry their water for them.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you to all 4 of our amazing speakers. And again, a huge thank you to the organizers of this national teaching event who lined up these amazing speakers. We have so much information and ammunition around which we can organize. I've got a few questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but let me begin with Rana. Could you talk, Rana, you talked about, diversity. Your remarks were amazing about anti-DEI efforts, but can you talk a little bit more about how attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts stifle our freedom to teach and learn, and how can we successfully push back against these efforts?
Well, I think what I was trying to get at in my remarks was how much DEI efforts and attacks on DEI are efforts just to control what can happen at the university, how the university can function, how it can run, who gets to make decisions about it. And at the same time, it's also tied to and feeds some of the attacks that we've seen for a long time now on histories of slavery, critical race theory, but also ethnic studies just for a long time, and critical ethnic studies for a long time. And what it and how and these things feed each other, even if they're not exactly the same thing. Strategies of DEI and inclusion, diversity, equity don't have to have the same kind of politics as a kind of radical social or gender justice platform have. And yet the foreclosure of each of them forecloses what's possible to think about race and gender, and what's possible to think about how we might structure university, or how we might structure our societies in ways that open up the best kind of life possibilities to the most people. So I think that there's some interplay there that's not exactly the same, but they're very much connected into the ideas of, like Isaac was saying, controlling what the university can be, right, and what we can teach and research in it. I want to just to answer that also just to kind of tell people who don't know about it, ethnic studies was formed by student and it was really formed by a lot of student organizing. It wasn't something the university just gave us. In California, the Third World Liberation Front, which was a kind of formation that included a lot of different racial and ethnic populations coming together to demand something bigger than ethnic studies at first. They wanted a third world college. They wanted to think about US racial formations and something that was larger than just these kind of siloed ways of thinking about race that we're familiar with in the US. So I think a lot of what I'm getting to is, we can think about dark money. We should be thinking about, quote unquote, dark money or political organizing, or the way that partisan politics in particular has organized the way that we're thinking about race and justice on campus. But we also really have to think about how we're thinking about race and justice on campus in terms of the concepts, the terms, and the histories, because those are going to lead us to different places than just defending maybe what we already have. We might be able to think about ways to do things differently and to do things better by turning to those histories. And those histories are the ones that are the most sidelined and visibilized and kind of under attack, because they're not even at the forefront of a liberal university formation, or necessarily at the forefront of every discussion of race or gender in places where we're supposed to be having those discussions. These are submerged histories, and they're not great, rah, 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 we've done everything kind of solutions, but they do give us places to think in more complex ways about race and what race means in the US and what it means globally, and how the US racial formations are transnational ones. I could talk about this for a long time, so I'm going to stop.
That was great. That was just right. I wanted to follow up, because we're trying to connect. We had these 4 speakers with 4 different topics, but these topics are completely connected. They've made connections during their talks, and we wanted to talk how they're interrelated. So I wanted to follow up with Jason on, where's my question? What role does debt play in repressing things like labor rights and academic freedom at universities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And, I'm learning so much from the colleagues on this panel, and in reading their work have learned so much as well. And so some of what I'm going to say is stuff that I've pulled from people here. I want to emphasize 2 things, actually. One is, I think it's really important to remember that we have to think of the university not only as in and of itself, but its relation to political economy. In other words, that we have to consider the ways in which the dynamics happening outside the university influence what happens inside the university, and vice versa, right? And I think one of the things that people have always been afraid of is that what we do on universities becomes prefigurative of other ways of being in the world, right? More just ways of being in the world with each other, creating new social relations that aren't capitalist, that aren't imperialist, that propose new ways of existing, et cetera. And so, in a sense, the university is set up to reproduce imperialist capitalism. And what I think a lot of people here in on the streets are saying is like, no, we envision a new way of thinking about ourselves and society. And so the university, and I think Isaac shows this in his book really clearly with the Koch brothers, the university is and always will be a site of ideological and material struggle. And if that's the case, then I think rather than always being on the defensive about our ideologies, we have to go on the offensive at some point. We have to say, yes, of course, education is inherently ideological. It is inherently political. You educate people to take part in the polis, whatever, the political state. So like you, even to say it's non-ideological is an ideological position. And so let's just own that. Let's just go for it. And let's build power around that. The question of debt and labor, I think, is essential. Debt is a labor issue. As I said in my talk, debt is a gift to capital insofar as that it makes workers more exploitable. Debt robs the time of the worker. Debt is, it also robs future wages. Even with student loan, reform, we have to remember, if you win a strike and you make more money and you're on an income-based repayment plan, percentage of that income-based repayment is going to go up. So you're giving your money back that you won in a hard-won strike. The other side of this is that debt becomes a way to discipline the strikes that win. We had historic victories at Rutgers, Columbia College in Chicago, longest strike of I think in the nation's history, other places where we've had wins. And what happens immediately after? Administration says we have deficits to pay. You guys are the cause of the deficits. We're now going to, in order to pay the creditors, because the creditors always get paid, the creditors never have to take haircuts. The creditors never suffer austerity, but we do. And so debt becomes a way to punish and hollow out victories of labor. This ultimately means then that we have to become less reliant, I would say not reliant, on Wall Street hedge funds and creditors. And we have to figure out another way to fund higher education. That's a longer conversation that we could have, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Jason. And if anybody wants to, if any of the panelists wants to follow up, just, let me know. My next question I'm going to direct to Erica. You had great talk about labor organizing, particularly contingent adjunct faculty. Talk about the relationship between labor organizing and the bedrock principles of particularly academic freedom, and the role that labor organizing plays in making teaching and research easier for faculty, for grad students, and even undergrads.
Sure. So I think from the position of part-time faculty members, adjunct faculty members, I think maybe I'll sort of start with saying this in the reverse, which is that precarity, that contingency makes us vulnerable, as I mentioned, to not being fired, but sort of like quietly disappeared because of some other reason that is made up by the administration in order to sort of get rid of you. And to sort of like map out how easy that is. I'm going to start by saying in our last bargaining session, we made these sort of historic gains. We won 21% raises for adjuncts over the next 2 years until our next contract negotiation. And then we learned through the grapevine that the PSU president is planning on essentially like cutting, so that's about 10% a year, cutting 10% of programming that's taught by adjuncts in order to make the budget up. There is a program in place of cutting, closing programs and cutting classes, hoisting those extra students onto full-time faculty by increasing their class sizes, or having them teach overloads, and they're on salary, so it doesn't cost the university extra when they do that if it's during the school year. So that's kind of the economic context. And then, if someone like me who is sort of putting myself out there as a labor organizer, my name is on a lot of these things that we do. When it comes time to cut courses from the sophomore inquiry line of courses that I teach from. It was interesting for me to find that my course, which is always full, was canceled for spring until I pointed out that actually my contract was for a different course, which wasn't canceled. So unfortunately, they got tricked into giving me my course back. But it would be very easy for someone to have a course canceled for any reason at all, if they are putting themselves out there for political or labor organizing in those contexts, like, for political speech, for contentious sort of topics, or for organizing rallies and protests, which have happened on our campus. We had a protest in the Board of Trustees meeting against the funding that we received from Boeing. And the university, has been disciplining, calling people in for disciplinary hearings. And the only reason I believe that the faculty who, was involved in that was not fired was because they are part of a labor union. So I think labor unions have an enormous role to play, and they only work if actually we are operating in solidarity with all of the other campus unions, whether or not we're actually wall to wall. I think this is something we learned from our colleagues at Rutgers, that sort of how to think about working together as a wall-to-wall union, whether or not you actually are. So I think we need to be organizing across our job categories heavily and frequently, and we need to, as a default, stick to protecting each other in these circumstances. So I think that's probably, enough commentary on that topic for now, but I'm happy to, say more if you like.
That was an excellent answer. Absolutely. The solidarity, having each other's back. That's the way it works. I have a couple more questions, but I think I have a question that I was going to ask all the panelists. I have two questions I was going to ask all four panelists to weigh in on. And, and so I'm not sure which one to ask. This is probably the difficult one. I would like to ask, well, I'll ask both questions and you can choose which one you want to answer. So I wanted to ask each panelist here's the question one is, what does higher education as a public good look like? You to describe that. Or you can choose to answer my other question, and I bet you'll all choose this because you're organizers. Can you say what's a particularly effective tool or a particularly effective strategy for fighting back? And let's start with Isaac, because I did have a question for Isaac, but you answered it in your remarks. It was, what role does dark money play and how do we push back against it? So instead, Isaac, can you pick A or B and answer one of those two questions?
Yeah, I'll take the first one. And so what does higher education as a public good look like? I think that it's really important for us to get out of this narrative that there was once a great university that is now crumbling before our eyes, and we have to go back to this vision of the university, right? There's a long narrative that the mid-20th century American higher education was this wonderful place, a panacea, and starting in the 80s, there was defunding and austerity. All that is true. And that we need to go back to the land grant model, the robust public university. And I think that it's important that we start from the understanding that university has always been hierarchical. They've always been elitist. They've always been exclusionary, except for those moments when political demands were made upon public institutions to democratize. And that the hard organizing of soldiers coming back from the Second World War, of civil rights activists, of anti-war activists, of feminists, of queer people, of people of color, demanding that the university greater reflect them and their interests, right? As Rana points out, critical ethnic studies, Black studies didn't just come from a gift from heaven, right? But they were fought for, and they were battles that were won. So I think that what does higher education as a public good look like? I think that it is a university that we build, right? That the university is the institution that we, as faculty, as students, as staff, as the public that funds, that we have a say in the ability to have the institution that we want. I think that what's happening right now, and the reason why you have this dark money attack, is that you have this overwhelming claim that students want university that they don't want to pay debt, right? That they want a university that's accessible, that people want to be able to take higher education and to do the kinds and to pursue their own interests, right? That they want those kinds of opportunities. And that freaks out those elites who want a docile workforce, an indebted workforce that has to work for low wages, right? As Mark Bousquet points out in How Universities Work, the crisis of higher education, that what the universities actually do is produce a low wage student population. That it's not that that students, that when you have a knowledge economy, is necessary to have kind of low wage workers, and the school and the universities are a place to train those. So a university for the common good would be one in which those who own the university, those who make the university, us and our students, that we say, no, we want a university that fits our image. And that we have the space and the capacity, and we push back against those political forces that are trying to prevent us from having a say over our labor and over our education and over our politics of study.
Thank you, Isaac. I think we have time for one more response, either to what does higher ed as a common good look like, or what's a particularly effective tool or strategy for fighting back?
I've got a quickie answer. Great. Okay. I would say, as far as like tactics or in that sort of realm of your questions, I really think that we need to radicalize our unions, take leadership positions, bring the struggle internally to your unions, and just know that staffers are more likely going to be more conservative than you are. That's been my experience. I'm in American Federation of Teachers. It's not a particularly radical union. And just seeing everything as an organizing opportunity, meaning like, you can organize your fellow workers also to sort of do an insurgent campaign inside of your union to change a position that it has. And that sort of agitation internally is also necessary. So in terms of like, yes, we need to have solidarity with all workers, but that doesn't mean we can't actually struggle internally to push our unions to be more radical. The only illegal strikes are ones that are unsuccessful.
Thanks, Erica. We've got 2 minutes left. I probably need just a minute to close it out. So if somebody else, Jason's unmuted, go.
In 30 seconds, this is going to sound weird, but a tactic and something we can use to free ourselves is actually the debt that they put us in. So I'm going to make a claim that where the danger lies, so grows the saving power. And why is that? Because there's nowhere in society that you have so many debtors in one place at the same time around a similar issue. In other words, if we figured out a way to bring debtors together on campuses across the country, we have a lot of power. The neoliberals, maybe they made a mistake in putting us all in the same place at the same time, and we need to capitalize on it.
30 seconds, where a good organizing tactic: look back at histories, look back at the histories of critical ethnic studies. Read Eli Meyerhoff's book Beyond Education. Like, we can really push this. Read about decolonizing efforts to decolonize, or maybe a better word for it is to make the university an anti-colonial kind of place, or to think about what kind of strategies would what strategies let us name things as ours, and who gets to name things and claim them. So I think that those are, and talk to a lot of people, and you don't have to talk to people or organize with people that you agree with all the time. Some of the most powerful coalitions that I've been in just from doing grad labor organizing years ago was with people that I did not think would agree with me and that also didn't agree with me, but we came together on certain issues and could push things through. So that's what I would say. And that's my 30 seconds. So I'm out.
Thank you all so much. It has been such an stimulating, such an informative, such an amazing conversation. I wish this was a seminar and I'd say, see you next week. But this has thank you all speakers. Thank you again to the organizers. This has been an amazing day of mobilization. And on behalf of Higher Organization, I thank the organizers and all the participants, all the viewers. High fives all around again. The way forward is through organizing, as Erica said, as clearly as anyone. We need to turn this incredible mobilization effort into growing the membership in our chapters and our locals and our organizational allies. We need to grow the membership and build solidarity and community and build solidarity and community in our membership. Today is the beginning. To continue, and additional meetings are planned, go to the National Day of Action website, which Mariah put in the chat, and email them so you're on the distribution list. Thank you all for your participation and your engagement today, and thank you, and onward.